Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you here today on this beautiful Friday afternoon in Charlottesville. Hello to the people in the audience, in person and online. My name is Ann Kokis, and I am a professor of media studies here at UVA, CKN chair professor at the Miller Center, and also the director of the East Asia Center. It's an honor and a privilege to welcome you to this talk today, because the person who will be giving the talk preceded me in many of these roles that I held and has been a mentor and a guide in both understanding what it is to be a director of the East Asia Center and the CKN chair at the Miller Center. And he's also a professor emeritus of politics, a current colleague at the Miller Center as a senior faculty fellow. Professor Womack has held roles in his life that have been formative in terms of the relationship between building the relationship between China and the United States. A personal story: when I came here, when I got this job in 2012, one of my colleagues at Rice University, Richard Smith, was like, I think you'll be okay at UVA because there's someone like Brantly there, and he's going to be a wise guide in the field. And he was right. And so we're very honored to have him here today to be talking about his newest project. And that project is actually based on, and just to kind of underscore what amazing contributions he's made, this book is actually based on a series of lectures that Professor Womack organized on behalf of the East Asia Center online in the midst of pandemic life. And that lecture series was called China and the Recentering of East Asia. Now, this was a series of dialogues that Professor Womack organized and helped us to stay intellectually engaged with China and with East Asia during a period of very limited travel. Was an incredibly important service for our community. Now, building on that amazing service, he is going to be here today presenting his most recent work, Recentering Pacific Asia, Regional China and the World Order. And this is built on the lecture series that we previously hosted at the East Asia Center. Now, I just want to give a note for all of the students and the emerging faculty here, just what an amazing kind of both service for the community that this is, but also what strategic scholarship it is to both, to have a lecture series that he organized, that he was then able to build into a book series that he is now presenting and sharing. And this is the sort of thing that that I look at and see and am really inspired by and want to build into my career. And so I just wanted to highlight that amazing work. Professor Womack is the author of a wide range of books and of monographs, articles focusing on China's relationship with Southeast Asia, and a wide range of other international relations. He's previously served as an endowed chair at the Schwarzman College in Beijing following his retirement. And one thing that isn't in his bio is the long-term impact that he's had on his students at the master's and PhD level. And I would say now, as the director of the East Asia Center, I've served in building these bridges with our alumni from a variety of different programs. And one thing that to a person I have heard from the alumni that I've worked with, who have worked with Professor Womack, is what a generous and what a thoughtful and what an inspiring role model he was that helped them to build their careers. And this is to a person. And I think that it's important to note this because it's the sort of thing that you don't see on someone's faculty bio. But I think if we're thinking about our contributions as faculty and as scholars, it's the sort of thing that I actually am able to think about and feel most profoundly. So I want to, with that, welcome Professor Womack to speak on his book, Recentering Pacific Asia, Regional China and the World Order. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ann. That was a touching introduction. I need a few moments to recover from it before starting to say anything else. But the first thing I have to say are other thank yous. And I might as well, besides thanking you, thank the East Asia Center, because this really has been my basic community here. And as Ann indicated, the book that I'm going to be talking about came about because of the East Asia Center. And I think it would not have come about without the East Asia Center. First and foremost, Dorothy Wong, your predecessor as director, she, from the first idea I mentioned it, she was enthusiastic. The East Asia Center will support it all the way. And that was key because, it was just an idea at the time. And one reason it's important for this particular project is that this book and that lecture series was a big think book, a big project, and it wasn't just library research and writing things down. It wasn't a niche type of progression in something. It's like, what is Pacific Asia anyhow? And actually, as you point out, the original title of the lecture series was, what is East Asia anyhow? And I figured out, well, East Asia is not the right name for it. We should rename it Pacific Asia. Pacific Asia is my concept. So that's Northeast Asia, Greater China, that's Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, PRC, and Southeast Asia. Now, in East Asia, in Pacific Asia, they would call it East Asia. But here in the US or in Europe, when you say East Asia, it often means Northeast Asia. And there's a neglect of Southeast Asia. And if there's one thing I won't tolerate, it's the neglect of Southeast Asia. Okay, so Pacific Asia clearly includes Southeast Asia as well. So without Dorothy's support, the project would not have been hatched, and without the support of the 4 commentators included in the book and included in the lecture series, it would not have gone forward either. Because I thought, if I'm rethinking this, I'm not the only thinker in the world, and sometimes I think there's thinkers in the area. There are major people whom I respect and who, if they say something I disagree with, I wonder, why am I wrong? They're the people that are that significant to me. And so I thought, maybe, and Dorothy supported me on this, maybe if I asked them to be commentators, not commentators on what I'm saying, commentators on what I'm saying, but commentators on the topic of each of the lectures. It would be it would add a dimension to the rethinking. The whole point of this is not to have revelation about Pacific Asia, but to get everybody to think about the framework, because the framework has changed. And that'll be one of the major points of my talk this evening. And thanks to you for coming to this on such a nice afternoon when all reasonable people would be outside. And what I'm going to be doing in this 40 minutes or so is not a retelling of the book for 2 reasons. One, I want you to read the book. And if I told you what the conclusion is, I tell you how it ended, everybody would, that book, yeah, I heard about that. No, it's going to be different. But it's basically on the same subject. What I'd like to do is emphasize 3 themes. Let's see if I can get the power to work. It worked. Thank you, Brian. Okay. The 3 themes are, first of all, Pacific Asia and China's regional role. Wait a minute. Did anybody bring a copy of the book?
I forgot the audience, and then we got the bookstore out here.
Oh, very good. That's what it looks like.
It'll be available. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
So we do have copies.
Okay. That's a relief. This is not in place of the book. It's not better than the book, and it's not a repeat of the book. It's different and exciting, and it will make you want to read the book. So Pacific Asia and China's regional role is the first topic. The second topic is world order in this century, because Pacific Asia and China's regional role is a big topic, but it's part of something larger. There's something else going on in the 20th century that is so big and so slowly moving, sort of like watching an hour hand. or watching global warming, except global warming at least has fluctuations like this summer. But watching things that are so big and so gradual that they're not noticed, even though they're shifting the whole sand on which our foundations of understanding are based. The last thing is US strategic options. Because I figure at that point, we want something to wake us up. And nothing like talking about what US strategic options are to wake people up and consider those types of things. But let's start with Pacific Asia and China's regional role. Why is Pacific Asia important? Well, let's look at this. If you look at Pacific Asia, I thought, how does the Pacific Asia compare to the United States in significance over this century? This century, it's almost a quarter gone now. And the really strange thing, I guess I have to jump. Is that the US started out 2/3 of the rest of the world. The rest of the world is US taken out, Pacific Asia taken out, everybody else, okay? 2/3 of the rest of the world in 2001. It goes down, and Pacific Asia starts out at 47%. By 2020, the proportions are almost reversed. Pacific Asia is 2/3 of the rest of the world's GNP. This is nominal GNP too. So the rise of Pacific Asia and the proportional change in the global economy is pretty remarkable. So, what difference does that make? Well, oh, that's wrong. It means that we should take Pacific Asia seriously as an entity, as a magnitude. But what about the entity? I mean, to have an economic region, it has to have circulation within the region. Well, about 50% of the imports and exports of Pacific Asia stay within the region. And that's a larger percentage than in Europe or in the United States. And if we looked at Pacific Asia and compared it simply to Europe and the United States, or EU and the United States, Pacific Asia's economy in purchasing power parity terms is larger. So we have a region that is the largest economic region in the world. And it's reasonable to talk about it as a region, not just to arbitrarily draw a circle around it, because it does trade with itself. And a good deal of that trade, of course, is within companies in the region. You know, multinationals producing, using parts from Japan and Taiwan to produce final products in China, or final products in Malaysia, which are using parts from Japan and maybe Thailand as well. Lots of cross investment in the region. All this type of economic interaction in the region is extremely important. And if you think about it, if they were just trading, it was just final product to final product trading in the region, that would mean less than this product development, this partial product circulation, because that partial product circulation is much more nuanced. Parts of the chain of the production chain can move, of course, but while that chain is where it is, that means that for that company or for that particular enterprise, getting that part to this place, to the next place, to the other place, all of them have to be done in order for any of them to be worth anything. So that interdependence of production is important. It's not just an exchange of production, it's an interdependence. Okay. So what about China's regional role in this Well, let me show this. I didn't update this. This is charts I did for Southeast Asia. But Southeast Asia is a major part, of course, of Pacific Asia. And right now, Southeast Asia started out as about 1992, 100%. China's production was equal to 100% of Southeast Asia's. Now it's up to 300% of Southeast Asia's. And that's approximately the same as the US relationship to Latin America. So that shows something of the prominence and centrality of China to the region. If we look at China, ASEAN, China, Southeast Asia per capita PPP, the interesting thing here is that this shows the transformation that China's neighbors have seen. Back in these early 82 days, China's GDP per capita wasn't any larger than the poor countries of Southeast Asia, Laos, Vietnam, etc. And then by the 1990s, it started to grow. And in 2018, it reached the per capita of Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia. So what you have here is China. This is important, not so much for scale like the last one. This is important for status, development status. And we look at China and we see it move from poor country to middle income country. We're mainly looking at the scale of China's production because that's where it becomes global from an American perspective. But if you're Malaysia looking at China, you're not just seeing that China's a lot bigger than Malaysia and a big part of its economy, but you're looking at eye level as far as the level of development goes. And that's all of China. And if you're visiting Shanghai, you're seeing a place a lot more impressive even than Kuala Lumpur. You know, you're seeing a place that is really impressive because after all, we're talking about China's entire population, not just the advanced coastal cities. So that aspect of China's regional role is important. But something that we lose sight of now, everybody in the United States lately, we've woken up to China's rapid growth over the last 10 years, especially. Okay, but we assume that China's going to keep on going. No, if you're China and China's neighbors now, what you're seeing is that China's rate of growth is not that much different from the rate of growth of other developing countries, other middle income countries in the region. And that can be broadened more or less to the rest of the world as well, as if you're looking at middle income countries. And there's room to grow in countries that have a large amount of space for urbanization development and economic development in general. And China is one of those. And now, so China is, as we know from that 300%, it's a risen power. But it's not rising in the sense of relative change of position vis-a-vis its neighbors to the same extent. It's there. It's not that it's not going anywhere, but it's not zooming up anymore. So that's all three of these things: this change in status, the scale of China compared to the other countries in the region, and this risen country rather than, you know, rocket trajectory country are big aspects of China's role. So what about world order? Well, like I said, that is that's an even bigger framework. That's a 500-year framework. Actually, in this slide, it's a several thousand-year framework. I took this slide from the Financial Times, and it shows that back in the year 2000, 1500, even up to 1820, the economic center of gravity in the world was slanted toward Asia, toward the east, because it was mainly a measure of population. How different could production be between an Eastern farmer and a Western farmer, if both economies are still agrarian. But actually, they were different, but even a double difference wouldn't make that much difference. The population was a bigger one. But then look at that March. Look at that March, all the way to 1913. And part of that actually is not just production increase, it's also population, relative population increase of the West. Because the advances in health and nutrition and various other things really help the West. It's not simply industrial production. And then 1940, a little bit slower, 1950, the ultimate. And then you have the post-war Japan kicking in, moving things back a little bit by 1960, starting further, and then by 2010, China and its neighbors have kicked in. And then the projection for 2025 is something more or less back toward the east. So we've had 500 years of westernization, modern Western modernization that has created a cleft between the east, between the west and the rest, between east and west. And what's been happening in this century, in the last 25 years, is a reduction of that difference, a convergence. Now, the convergence is in aggregate terms. As we'll see, the convergence produces 2008, 2008, the per capita, the total production of developing countries' GDP exceeded the West, developed countries, for the first time since the 19th century. Okay, and it continues. The relative change continues. China's a big part of that, but it's not all of it. That's why I'm saying this is the even larger picture. So this larger picture is partly a product of increasing productivity of the other countries, of the rest, okay? Partly it's a question of larger population. You have the population blooms, not only in Africa, but let's say in China, you have a huge increase of population for the 1950s on. China's population, 1954, I think it was 530 million. And now the 1.3 billion, so it makes for a big change. And then the populations of Africa and other developing countries have gone up as health benefits have changed. So the per capita production started out in 1980 at 15%. It has risen by now to 27% now. And that's good. That's a significant increase, but it's never going to catch up. At least not in my lifetime. I don't know if anyone wants to aspire to be 100 years old or 150 years old. Maybe it won't be anybody's life. So you have this difference between what I call demographic power, that is the power of population, which of course China and India are the principal beneficiaries of, and wealth power, which remains a major power. And the United States has a partial advantage in demographic power because we are the largest largest developed country in population as well as in product. But this whole picture of global change is really an important picture for understanding what's happening in Pacific Asia and what's happening in Pacific Asia's relationship to the world, because it's a good part of this difference. And the prospects are that it will remain a good part of this difference. This is the estimate of growth for 2023 put out in April, and it shows China at 34% of projected growth for the year, and Indonesia 4%, Japan 1.8, Vietnam 1.7, Philippines 1.6. If you add those together, it's like 48% of the anticipated economic growth this year was pacification. India's 15.4%, so that's pretty good too. Western Hemisphere is 13.7, Europe 7.1. Now, that was April. Things have changed since April. You know, you have the slowdown in the Chinese economy. But one thing this chart shows is that the slowdown in the Chinese economy is not only China's problem, it's the region's problem, and it's a global problem as far as continued economic growth goes. So we have this situation of major growth in the South, major growth in Pacific Asia, major change in the economic weight in the world. And part of this is inevitably a decline in hegemonic power, global hegemonic power. Obviously, the US is the chief loser in a decline of global hegemonic power, because this is not a system which is easily kept into a hub and spoke center economy and dependent little economies, my way and the highway, or the highway type of relationship. What you have in this spread, the good news of what you have in this spread of production and spread of wealth, is a decentralizing of the global economy. The bad news of the decentralization and the increase of sovereign agency is that it means less certainty. Instead of knowing that the policeman's on the corner, you know, and knowing what you should do to keep the policeman happy, you're now in a situation where there isn't a policeman in the corner. It's not quite chaotic. Oh, one thing to remember is that what's happened is not after effects of thermonuclear war, right? Not devastation, but production. Not devastation, but success. Not chaos, but almost the opposite of chaos, progress. It's just that the progress is diversified. And so what do you do about that? And what do you do if you're Malaysia or Rwanda or Argentina? You know, what do you do in a world where the United States is no longer securely in control? What do you do in your relationships with your neighbors and their neighbors and to the global economy? Well, you try to control your uncertainties. And how do you do that? Well, with difficulty, first of all. Well, what you want to do is agree with neighbors, maybe in groups, maybe individually, to have production relationships, exchanges of various kinds, to have partnerships. Okay, now partnerships are not exclusive. If Vietnam just raised its partnership with the United States to highest level, strategic, comprehensive strategic partnership level, but it already has comprehensive strategic partnerships with China, India, Russia, and South Korea. Okay, so the partnerships are not alliances. They're recognitions of mutual interest. And that pattern of recognitions of mutual interest and formal recognition, and including a respect for the other side in that recognition. Those are the primary diplomatic tools of many economies now, including China. And I think they're the appropriate tools for this what I call a multinodal world. And I call it multinodal because I don't like multipolar, certainly not unipolar, certainly not a situation that the US is in control. It's not bipolar. The Cold War model doesn't fit anymore. Putin's proving that. It's but there's not a set of countries that make the decisions, and the rest are simply passive bystanders. And yet, power matters. We're talking about a situation where countries have more discretion in their international relationships than they used to, because there's not a central power. But that doesn't mean that we're existing in a world of mature, friendly, I don't know, Quaker, Buddhist countries that are going to really, I'm okay, you're okay with everyone else. There's differences of interest and conflicts of interest. So you handle those different, you want to minimize uncertainty. You want to minimize the effects of the differences of interest and minimize the effects of conflicts of interest. And partnerships are important to that. What's the option to partnerships? Well, alliances. Alliances seem to be a better solution because you're siding with a stronger power. And of course, the US has heritage alliances in the Pacific Asia region. South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Australia, and although I don't include Australia. Australia is its own continent, so it doesn't count Pacific Asia. Thailand. But to a great extent, these have become heritage alliances. That is, the alliance, each of these partners has not only a larger trade relationship with China than with the United States, but China is their largest trading partner. So they have a lot to lose if an alliance becomes exclusive. And to the extent that the US puts pressure on those alliances and says, if the US says, you're either with us or against us, then those countries have to think twice, because being with the US might be against China, and they might have more to lose there and less reliability in the American connection. To give an illustration from a little bit earlier, Vietnam sided with the Soviet Union in 1978, 79, and that was to protect it against China. It caused all sorts of headaches for Vietnam, and then they felt like they'd been stabbed in the back by Gorbachev, probably the only act of war Gorbachev ever committed in 1986 in the Vladivostok Treaty, when he said that the relationship to China was more important. So alliances you essentially subordinate your foreign policy, at least in an important respect, to whoever the alliance leader is. And whereas that sounds good to us, let's revivify the alliances, doesn't sound so good to the actual alliance members. So that gets us to my final point that I want to talk about, which is US strategic options. And I don't talk about these this way in the book, but the background for this is in the book. First of all, that there's the anti-China option. These are simplified options, and they're not exclusive, really. The anti-China option, China as enemy; the non-China option, US as alternative to China. And the last one is global leadership, enhance global values, respect autonomy. And on the anti-China option, there's the things that are quite familiar to us. Decoupling. Controlling technological change, transfer to China, revivifying alliances, China as the pacing threat for military expansion, and further military growth. So China as enemy is something that I think is pretty much, although unspoken, it is to a great extent a default option in American strategic thinking at the moment. And there's plenty of good examples for that, but I think it seems to be a universal thing. I don't think this will last, because its own internal negative consequences, I think, will appear, but it is certainly the case now. What are the problems with this? Well, the whole idea is China's growing, China's becoming a threat. Let's keep China down, let's keep China out. And the thing is that we're not in a position to keep China down, not in a position to keep China out. In a sense, it's a situation of denial of a good deal of what we've talked about already on the growth of Pacific Asia, the integrity of Pacific Asia, and the growth of the global South and multinodal type of situation. Is it necessarily wrong? No. If China acts as the enemy, if China rises as the challenger in every respect, and to some extent China does that, then treating China that way is appropriate action. But to watch China's behavior and not note how China's behavior is reacting to the hostility that it perceives is a whole different question. So the second thing, much more reasonable, be US as non-China, US as an alternative to China. This is important to Pacific Asia because they're all dependent on China. And so the idea of there being a big place that isn't China, that's not threatening and not forcing their behavior, is a very useful thing. And I'm happy to say that our former student, Dan Crittenbrink, who's now Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Affairs, made the most eloquent statement at East-West Center on this idea that we're not trying to isolate China. We're just welcoming the countries coming to us. And there's a lot of truth in that. And you can consider the partnership with Vietnam. The important thing, the difference between non-China and the anti-China is that the anti-China people would like say, first we establish our partnership, then we get them to drop the China partnership. Okay. But from a non-China perspective, adopting a partnership is okay. If they keep the China partnership, that's their decision. If they develop partnerships with Japan, with the rest, everyone else, that's wonderful. And if they really value their relationship with ASEAN, we should value our relationship with ASEAN as well. So that non-China idea of US as alternative to China is basically, it's not a bad strategic posture. And it's depending on how China behaves, it'll be more or less successful, which points out one of its strategic weaknesses, which is that it's reactive. It's really a question of how China, if countries feel like they must hedge against China, or I shouldn't say if, to the extent that countries feel they must hedge against China, then they should, develop their non-China connections. We can go stronger than that. Non-China connections are good in themselves. Connections are good in themselves. So already, to the extent that the US returns to Southeast Asia, Pacific Asia, Indo-Pacific, all of these returns to a region and respecting the region are things that are positive for global strategic development. But can we be more than just non-China? I mean, to some extent, that's letting China be the lead foot in political economic developments, especially in Pacific Asia. I would say, yes, beyond that, we should emphasize global leadership. But by emphasizing global leadership, I do not mean just preaching that we are the global leaders. I mean, leadership is not something, I think leadership to date in American diplomacy has been presumed as existing. I think we need to work for global leadership. We need to make sure that the United States global position is beneficial to everyone else. That's the question. The question isn't whether we feel good about what we say. The question is who's clapping. And the question is the audience, because we're in an audience, a world of an audience of autonomous actors, a world that will make its own decisions. And these global values could include things like global warming and many other similar values, that's most obvious, that China would have too. And the important thing about global leadership is that it has to be global, it has to be inclusive. Being the non-China is not quite inclusive. There is that not, okay? And so what I'm talking about is, this is, and to be global leadership, you have to respect the autonomy of all other countries, including China, and develop policies that would be respectful of all other countries. Doing that, it preserves, let's say it extends in a positive way the existing global centrality that the United States has. The opposite is to do things like sanctions and financial system changes that impose, depend on a monopoly of, say, US dollar financing systems, and uses that to pursue unilateral interest, or at least only presumptively multilateral interest on the part of the US, showing to everyone that in that respect, US global leadership is not to their interest. In that respect, it'd be better to have more RMB in your pocket because the dollar, that might be more reliable than the dollars you have in your pocket. So these considerations, it may sound like it's a question of normative attitudes, and to some extent it is, but norms have a basis in reality. And we're talking about long-term strategy. China's not going to go away. China is a risen power now. China can make its own mistakes. And we can talk about the mistakes China may make or even is likely to make. And those will diminish its role and cause more countries to hedge against it. But as far as our own strategic options goes, we should be open to China doing well as China doing poorly. So let me stop there. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for your being such an amazing audience. It looks like we have a couple of questions in the chat. But I do want to offer the floor to our in-person audience first, because to thank you for coming out. So does anyone have a question for Professor Womack? Yes. And if you could introduce yourself and just give a little bit of background, because we're all, building this community here. So.
Thank you, Anne. So I'm Clive Wong. I'm an assistant professor at Washington Lee University, assistant professor in politics. So my question is about the last point you talk about, the three options for U.S. foreign policy strategy. I think an interesting thing is that for all the 3 points, they have counterparts, almost exact counterparts in Chinese foreign policy too. So we also have in China, we also have the kind of U.S. Anti-U.S. option, and we have the non-U.S. option, which is promoting China as an alternative to the U.S., whatever that means. And China is also kind of pursuing its own global leadership through promoting its own version of the global values in terms of constructing this commonwealth of shared destiny or common values of humankind, and et cetera, et cetera. How do you compare the U.S. options and Chinese options? And especially, you mentioned that in the U.S. right now, the anti-China option seems to be the default option. Do you think that's also the case in China, that is the anti-U.S. option is the default option?
Great question. And certainly I agree with you that you can find the mirrors to these three options in Chinese diplomacy. I would say that Chinese diplomacy tends to be more careful in its expression than American diplomacy. Also, it's not in a denial position. I mean, one of the differences between our attitude toward China now and the old Cold War, the origins of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, is that no one doubted the Soviet Union was powerful. It had just beaten Hitler. It had just occupied Berlin, Eastern Europe. So there's no question that no, it's not there, or we can make it go away. It's a question of how to cope with it as it was. The attitude, to a great extent, there's an attitude of the anti-US attitude. You can really see in some of the more extreme statements of politicians that, basically China is something we can make go away. If we only are resolute enough, we can make it go away. That's absurd, but it's part of the anti-China attitude. The anti-US attitude, the presumption is US will never be anything but anti-China. And therefore, the default, that becomes the default assumption that justifies the anti-US policy. A non-US position is more interesting. It's more competitive with the US. And you see that in both in bilateral relationships as well as in more general strategic things where for instance, after the US, Japan, South Korea dialogue, there's talk of a South Korea, Japan, China dialogue. And so you have, that type of thing. Sometimes that's very beneficial. China was the first country to join the Treaty of Amity of Southeast Asia in 2002. India was the second. US finally 8 or 9 years later joined. And all of that, I think that was open as an option for the previous 15 years from ASEAN. But once one country did it, everybody is thinking, should we do it too? And so there's a lot of positive effects to competition. And then there's negative effects to competition as well. Military buildup on both sides justified by the buildup on the other side, or projections that build up. The last thing that you mentioned is alternative global views. And this doesn't get much attention in the US, but it gets a lot of expression in China. And just this morning, I was reading Wang Yi's statement on the new vision for global humanity. I think these things deserve more serious consideration in the United States than they tend to get. They tend to be simply dismissed. I don't even know if they tend to be read, even by diplomats. And I think that it would be a good idea from that last option of global leadership to look at those Chinese statements and say, well, what do we agree with on that, and what do we not agree with? And a huge amount of it we agree with, and we're saying now, they're just blowing so. Maybe we should sniff that smoke and see if it's bad smoke or good smoke. And I'm not trying to get people to smoke again. Still, that type of more serious treatment of China as it is something that I think is key.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that great question, and thank you for that great answer. And I think maybe you were referring to like campfire smoke. But sorry, we were in the fall.
That's like fragrances.
Fragrances, yes. There was, smoky scotch, maybe. All right, so we have, we're here all night, guys. So I wanted to ask additional questions from our in-person audience. Yes.
Hi, Professor.
Dr. Ju.
I'm Hong Zhenru, a postdoc at East Asia Center. And I want to ask you about the global leadership aspect. So we know China is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas, and also it is making the biggest investment into those new energies and like renewables, etc. But what I've been seeing in the US is a constant dismissive of this effort by citing, oh, they're building more coal plants. So they're not committing to global warming. So I feel like I feel that that's actually going to cause the US to be committed to show less leadership in this greenhouse in the global warming issue, because they feel like they have this consistency that China is not doing something, but actually China has been doing great leap forward in that.
No, it's a great question. And China certainly, you know, if you look at simple statistics, China looks like it's on both sides on the renewable energy side. One side, you know, largest producer of greenhouse gases, other side, largest producer of electronic vehicles, and solar power, and highest implementation rate on solar and wind power in the world. And there was a statement from the energy secretary here today where she was saying, you know, we have to be careful on trying to switch to renewable energy because China controls a lot of the essential ingredients, and we don't want to have China weaponize these ingredients and have us be dependent. And I was thinking about that. I think, did I just hear an argument for coal power? It was really interesting to think of the implications of that for U.S. energy policy. And that's exactly the kind of thing where global leadership, it included comprehensive climate thing, you know, what you'd want to do is ensure that these things were, thank China for its production, encourage China to produce in other places as well. Do things to solidify that network rather than assuming that because we weaponize what China needs from us, they will weaponize what we need from China. Okay, then we go something that any person from the global south would raise here is, let's talk per capita greenhouse gases. And not only per capita greenhouse gases, we're talking China, let's talk source of greenhouse gases. Is it physical production? Is it cement? Is it types of production like steel and cement that you cannot reduce to zero? Or is it the air conditioning in your banks? There's various differences in the sources of greenhouse gases and per capita, and all of those things make the United States look particularly bad, worse than Europe. Europe is ahead of us in taking these types of things seriously. And those are not unreasonable considerations. But I think it also should be said that China has a greater intrinsic interest in not so much greenhouse gases, but the related issue of pollution in most places too, because of the concentration of its very large population in Africa and the production of the material production of the economy. And so pollution and greenhouse gases are something that China has to take seriously. If it was the only country in the world, it would have to take seriously. No, it's not either driven or prevented by American critique.
All right, terrific. Thank you, Dr. Zhu. And Dr. Zhu is a new member of our East Asia Center community, so we're very happy to have you here. And as is Dr. Wang, he's a new faculty affiliate. So we've got some great scholars here at the East Asia Center. I would love to welcome additional questions from our audience. Yes, Professor Wang.
Hi, Assistant Professor of Sociology in Wang. I really enjoy inspiring lectures, and then you mentioned that that the way in which the integration of Asia, China and Asia Pacific is a slow moving process, accumulation of half a century of trade and investment relationship. So I wonder whether the way in which that this regional order unravels would be, if it does unravel, would it be faster and the way in which it accumulates, it just strikes me how effective still for the US in the past 5 years to still kind of pressure traditional new allies to reaffirm and renew their partnership, especially in semiconductor industries. It has been very effective in isolating China. And then we know that on the landscape of global value chain, there's also kind of slow moving away from the centrality of China in the global value chain production. So I wonder if this is already happening, and if it does, at what pace you will predict that this Asian Pacific order is changing to some extent?
That's a great question, and I think that it's not an either or thing, that continuing to have a region or having the region dissociate from China and hedge against China. But the way I think of it is contrasting two different concepts of region: the Indo-Pacific, which is primarily a political concept, and Pacific Asia, which is primarily an economic region. And what holds the Indo-Pacific together, especially from the US mentality, is the everybody but China. Okay, and the idea of what we all have in common is concern about China and what it's doing. So you have this political venue. I wouldn't call it a region, because if you look at the Indo-Pacific trade, well, first of all, you have to decide who's in the Indo-Pacific, and that's a problem. And then if you start looking at Indo-Pacific cross trade, it doesn't have the same continuity, the same connectivity that Pacific Asia does. Pacific Asia is a big part of it, but you leave China out of Pacific Asia and hook it up with India and whomever else you want to use from Southeast Asia for your idea of Indo-Pacific, and you have a very different economic relationship. But it is politically important. Everybody but China. So everybody has a concern of being a neighbor of China and a dependency of China to various extents. And this is a question served more remotely by global interests, because as China has risen as a global power, Europe and the United States, of course, are interested in the Indo-Pacific, in this idea of a regional constellation. I would say that to the extent that China alienates its neighbors, to the extent it makes Japan think that Japan's interests are more with the US, more hard hedging and balancing against China, and less continuing the economic relationships that is built up with China, then China's policies. China can alienate its region. I don't think the US can unilaterally force the region to disintegrate. It's certainly putting other options to the region. And if you think about them as the non-China options, then those options are welcome. You think about them as anti-China options. The only way an anti-China option will be welcome is if people are scared enough of China to lose the benefits and to lose the autonomy of their decision-making that being anti-China would involve. Great question. I have a paper on this. Thought to publish, I hope.
I have a question too about those three US strategy options. You clearly don't like the anti-China policy and emphasize the advantages of the other ones providing a lot more autonomy to our Asian partners. And I wonder if you would consider among the disadvantages of these options 2 and 3, the autonomy making it difficult to coordinate the activities of the US and its partners, defined as either allies or non-military partners. Because if we just invite countries a la carte, join us when you want, help us out on the things you care about. We don't really need you when the things are make you uncomfortable or impose some costs on you. That means the US is always going to be bearing the biggest burden of the heavy lifting. And we'll only get help on the things where the countries care the most about their immediate backyard, or they somehow see an advantage to themselves of cooperating with us. So in kind of avoiding free riding and potentially also restraining. Right now, it's hard to imagine restraining, but it's at least possible that in these alliances, the countries close to China start picking fights or getting most concerned and behaving in ways that aggravate the relationship with China. And allies can also restrain their partners, as well as motivating them to do their share. So is it possible to overcome some of those disadvantages of the other two strategies you mentioned in some way you can describe? Or is it possible to maybe use the alliances in a more benign way that is not quite so anti-China?
Professor Shapa, could you introduce yourself?
And I'm Len Schappa from the politics department, so I've been here as long as Brantly. Longer, by a year.
Yes. Well, that's a great question. And it's a great inside the beltway kind of question. Because and the free riding that goes on is in the non-China policies, there's parts of it that are not so clear. But are definitely there, and one reason for the smiles on our partners. Vietnam runs a huge trade deficit with the United States. And India runs a huge trade deficit with the United States. 6 of the top 10 trade deficits of the US are in the Indo-Pacific. Okay, so there's kind of a let's see, you've heard about the the Belt and Road Initiative's debt traps. Well, we have something working for us I'd call a surplus trap. That one reason Vietnam will smile at us is because they don't want the tariffs we put on China applied to Vietnam. And I'm sure that's the case with India too. So does this really advantage us? If we were taking a green shade view of the raising of the partnership with Vietnam, what have we got? We're not any more committed to their defense, and they're not any more committed to our defense. So what have we built? Well, if we view the world as a balance of power situation and is essentially a bipolar contest between two global powers, each out to outdo the other, then that securitization of the strategy seems very reasonable. But I would like to question that the fundamental assumption there, that bipolarization and that securitization of our thinking about our strategy is appropriate. And if it is appropriate, then, if we're in some sort of Thucydides trap situation, then how real are our options with the change in the global economy? But it's a good question. The question is how significant is, how determining is the security question and our strategic relationships in Pacific Asia.
John, Actuary John, and the politics department. I in some ways feel like you're not asking the right questions here. Right?
Well, then you do it.
Yeah, no, I will. What I won't ask you is whether you include Russia in the Pacific, and it's not clear why it certainly is a Pacific power. One thing, or I won't ask you also whether Russia's relationship with China is a partnership or an alliance. Nor will I ask you how the United States can exercise leadership when it can't keep its government open. But what I will ask you is, when I say I'm not certain you're asking the right question, because it seems to me that, as your data shows, sort of the rise of Asia Pacific, I mean, has happened. It's risen, right? So the real
Pacific Asia, please.
Pacific Asia, right? Pacific Asia. But the real question to me is actually sort of the nature of the order of Pacific Asia, rather than the rise. And what will China's position be in that order? And it seems to me that that's a fundamental issue for how the United States, what its strategy should be and how it should react. But I mean, it's interesting to me, for someone who knows so much about asymmetry, that today when you talk about partnership, you talked about it outside of the context of asymmetry. But it seems to me that these asymmetric partnerships are going to be fundamental to how the Pacific Asia order works its way out.
Well, that's a great question. And of course, this is all handled in the book. But,
Just for sale outside, by the way. FYI, like for those of you who are, yeah, I mean, this is previous studies, we do this, like.
it's a great question. But first of all, let me do with your first non-question, which is partnership or alliance with Russia. And I would say partnership, and a partnership that we could talk about this for a long time, of course, and I don't want to, but a partnership that China has many misgivings about, and has had many misgivings about, depending on which part of the Chinese leadership you're talking about from the beginning of Putin's invasion. And I can use, and have used, in a different setting, Putin's invasion of Ukraine as the best proof of a post-Cold War, post-hegemonic situation. And my argument is, even if Putin had won, even if he had occupied Kiev, even if he controlled Ukraine after that, and even if NATO was slow to respond to the fait accompli, it still would have been a disaster for Russia. Because we're in a different world now. We're not in a small war. He would have ruined his relations with Europe. He would have further militarized the Russian economy. And China would not feel closer to Russia at that point. China's relationships to Europe and to the United States are more important than relationships to Russia. Okay, now to your question. What was your question? Asymmetry. Asymmetry. Yes, well, you're absolutely right. Asymmetry is vital. And if we were talking about this, a whole multinodal matrix, power counts, it just doesn't determine. So you have this matrix of powers. Obviously Cambodia has less power than Thailand or Vietnam or China, and it has to figure out its relationships in this mix of options. And one way it stabilizes its expectations is by joining ASEAN. Okay, and that's very important. So that type of partnership relationship is not simply bilateral. Typically they're made bilaterally, but it's part of a general strategy. And as far as the partnerships being, China's partnerships being asymmetric, if China doesn't handle its asymmetric relationships well, it will end up alienating the region, starting with Japan. And if it, for instance, engages in military activity against Taiwan, that will alienate the region. Taiwan is an active part of Pacific Asia as an economic region. And it's not, the cross-strait relationship is not simply a sovereign question, bilateral sovereign question between China, PRC, and Taiwan. It's not simply a triangular US, China, Taiwan relationship. It's a regional relationship, and the regional cost, and not just a relationship with Japan either. Japan's regional relationship for Taiwan. The regional cost of military action against Taiwan would be profound. And that would be the kind of thing that would cause alliances to matter, really become more salient.
So I do want to give a quick pitch. If you're interested in these questions, we do have a talk coming on November 17th with Scott Kastner talking about cross-strait relations.
Oh, right.
At the East Asia Center, same time, similar place, I think. But I do want to, I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one. And if not, I have one that I've been saving. So I want to kind of say the quiet part out loud here. So we are talking about Pacific Asia, which is not the Indo-Pacific and is not the Asia Pacific and if you could share a little bit more, and I know that we, this is also probably, I don't want to give away the full point of the book, but if you could lure us into a little bit more about that, as we walk out to look at the book and think about it further. I would love to know a little.
What a wonderful leading question.
Yeah, I do what I can.
Discuss this in some detail, which I haven't even mentioned, is the historical background of Pacific Asia and of China's diplomacy and how that diplomacy has differed fundamentally because of situation, not because it's higher morals or whatever, because of situation from competitive empire mentality of Western diplomacy. And so you have, China's always been in the middle. Its presence in the middle and connectivity from the middle. Its population is it's over half the Pacific Asian population. Its production as, first of all, as production in silk and tea and ceramics, scaled artisanal production leading the region. So everybody's looking at China. Is China in control of the region? No, especially not with the nomads. Hell, you have dynasties that conquer China. From the nomads. So you have the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols, you have the Qing dynasty with the Manchus. So China remains in the middle. It isn't moving around. It is like the Assyrians fighting the Hittites, fighting the Hattites, fighting the Greeks, fighting the Romans, fighting the Persians. It's not moving all over, and it doesn't see its wealth in like the Phoenicians or the Corinthians or the Athenians in overseas expansion or overseas colonies or whatever. It's a more central mentality, and it's always on the central end, not necessarily the most powerful end, but the central end, not necessarily hierarchical control end of relationships with neighbors. Okay, and that provides a very different historical background, a very different set of presumptions and common sense, and not just for China, but it also affects the neighbors. Although the neighbors have a very different view of China's cultural superiority from the way China does, and has a very different view of China's motivations than China does. Just like our neighbors have a very different view of those things of the US than we do. So, but that difference in composition, that difference in diplomatic culture, I think is something that we totally miss. You read Bob Gates' statement in Foreign Affairs today, he's making assumptions about China being, it's like a mirror reflection in terms of mentality and goals of the US. Mirror reflection, China's -1, and we have to deal with them. And we have to be strong against them because they're certainly against us. That whole presumption needs to be challenged, need to be questioned. And the mentality of the diplomatic history of Pacific Asia has to be considered. And it's something that is pretty much totally missing